most remarkable statement of the Incarnation ever made in the Christian tradition is found right at its very beginning. In the second chapter of his letter to the church in Philippi, St. Paul quotes a hymn which predates his time and therefore is very close to Jesus' own life, death, and resurrection. Quoting the hymn, he says that the one who was in the form of God did not think being like God was anything to be clung to, but emptied himself and took on the form of a servant, becoming like us in all things except sin. Now think about that with me for just a moment, that what Paul claims is that we are like Christ, and that Christ has chosen to become one with us rather than remaining in the form of God. It is, I think, without question, the most extraordinary compliment that has ever been paid to being a human being. And that, after all, is what the Incarnation is really about. It's not first and foremost a revelation of who God is. First and foremost, it's the revelation of who we are. The Incarnation tells us something about what it is to be a human being. Now, what does it tell us about being a human being? Well, I suggest to you that it picks up on a theme that is very deeply grounded within the whole of Israel's tradition for many centuries before the appearance of Christianity. In the very first chapter of the book of Genesis, we read that on the afternoon of the sixth day, and since God is going to take time off on the seventh day in the story, this is the end of the process of creation. On that afternoon, God creates the climax of all of creation, the high point of creation, what everything has been building up to. And it turns out to be the creation of human beings. And in describing how God creates, the pattern of the first 5 days is broken. You remember in the familiar story of Genesis 1, on each of the first 5 days, the pattern has been, God said, let there be whatever. And there was whatever. And God looked at whatever and saw that it was good. For the very first time, on the afternoon of the sixth day, God is depicted in the story as pausing to deliberate before God creates. Let us make the human being in our image and likeness. For the first time, God does not just say, let it happen, and it happens. God pauses to plan what is about to be done. And God takes a blueprint for this all-important point in creation. The blueprint is God's self. Let us make the human being in our image and likeness. Now, that's a very important theme throughout the whole of the Hebrew tradition, because later on in the Mosaic Law, over and over and over again, we find a very strong insistence on not making any images of God. Well, the word image, when the image, making of an image of God is forbidden, is exactly the same word as we find used in Genesis 1 when we're told that we're the image and likeness of God. And that, of course, is the reason why the Israelite tradition did not think it possible to make an image of God. It was redundant. God had already made an image of God. We are it. In Genesis 3, we come to the Adam and Eve story. And you remember in the Adam and Eve story, the first temptation which the serpent presents to those first human beings is not, please notice, disobedience. The temptation is not pride. The temptation is phrased in the most important line that evil is ever given in the whole of the Scriptures. Eat this and be like God. You see, the temptation is really to reject what we've already heard in chapter 1. In chapter 1, what we've heard is that we have been made in the image and likeness of God. And in chapter 3, the serpent's temptation is, don't believe that you're like God. You're not like God. God is great and glorious and powerful and majestic and wise. You're not like that. Being a human being is a pretty messy business. You don't want to be a human being. You have to get out of being a human being in order to be like God. That in fact, Genesis 3 presents as a temptation the rejection of what we've already heard in Genesis 1. The origin of sin, according to the Hebraic tradition, is the rejection of the goodness of being a human being. It's the insistence that we are not, as human beings, in the image and likeness of God, that we must become something other than, something more than human beings in order to truly be like God. In other words, the very first sin, the origin of evil, the entry of evil into creation, according to the Hebrew tradition, is the refusal to accept the goodness, the rightness of being human. It's a refusal to accept the goodness of creation. If I could put it this way, the real sin at the origin of all evil in the world is a rejection of the first judgment of God, which is, in Genesis 1, God looked at all that he had made and saw that it was very, very good. And the serpent insists, no, it's not. You, this particular part of creation, the human being, you are trash. And the acceptance of that temptation is what leads to all of the rest of evil. The beginning of sin is the despair of the goodness of creation. That's why when Paul speaks of the mystery hidden from all generations, but now revealed in our time, what Paul is talking about is the extraordinary claim of that hymn that he quotes in Philippians chapter 2. Namely, that God did not think being like God was anything to be clung to. So God empties God's self and takes on humanity, becoming like us in all things except sin. If I can put it this way to you, the great mystery hidden from all generations and revealed in our time is God's secret ambition. From all eternity, God has wanted to be exactly like me. Now, I must admit that seems to me an excellent testimony to God's good taste. But the fact is that what Paul is talking about is the goodness of being human, the rightness of humanity. The immense dignity of the human person is right at the heart of the Christian tradition because it flows directly from the doctrine of the Incarnation itself. Indeed, the Incarnation, as the highest compliment ever paid to being human, is the rejection of original sin. Original sin, the origin of evil, being the rejection of the goodness, the rightness of being a human being. Consequently, when in the Gospels we hear that Jesus has become like us in all things except sin, what we are saying is that our humanity is what now unites us with the fullness of God's glory. Think about that with me for a moment. One of the great images for this in the Christian tradition is the doctrine of and the feast of the Ascension, one of the most poorly celebrated of the great liturgical days in the Catholic and Christian calendars. Very badly celebrated because, unfortunately, we usually turn it into a sort of divine bon voyage party as Jesus makes his departure from earth. The point is not that Jesus has gone back to where he was before. The point is that what ascends into heaven, what in the traditional imagery of the Creed is now seated at the right hand of the Father in glory, is a human being like us in all things except sin. And that therefore, what unites us with the fullness of the glory of the Father is our humanity. There is one link that you and I and God have in common, and that is we're all human. That's the implication of the doctrine of the Incarnation. And therefore, if there is anything that the Christian tradition must emphasize, it is the immense dignity, value, and importance of genuine, full, and authentic humanity, because it is by being fully and authentically human, by being as human as we possibly can be, that you and I become more fully and truly like God. That means that any form of spirituality which belittles humanity, which de-emphasizes the goodness and dignity of the human person, far from being a channel to God, is within the Christian tradition an obstacle to genuine union with God, to truly being like God, to truly being holy. If this is so, then any work which furthers the dignity of the human person is also a work of sanctification, a work of holiness. In the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, we read in paragraph 1 of chapter 1 that the Church, by her union with Christ, is a kind of sign or sacrament of intimate union with God and the unity of all of humanity. A very distinguished Catholic theologian, Nicholas Lash, has written that usually in theology, the most interesting and important word in doctrinal statements is and. And that's true in that statement. The Church is a kind of sign or sacrament of intimate union with God and the unity of all of humanity. The Church is called to be a sacrament of two realities, but those two realities are intimately linked. I suggest to you that that statement in Lumen Gentium, that now classic description of the Church and its ministry, is in fact a recapturing of a very, very ancient Christian insight. You remember in Mark's Gospel, when Jesus is asked by a scribe what the greatest commandment is, and he responds by citing two Old Testament references, that one must love God with one's whole mind, heart, and soul, and the second commandment, which Jesus says is exactly like it, that one love one's neighbor as oneself, that the scribe responds, "Well done, Master. Indeed, nothing is more important than to love God totally, and there is no sacrifice, no offering greater than loving our neighbor." Jesus says in response, "You are very close to the kingdom of heaven." What elicits that praise from Jesus, the single greatest compliment paid to anyone in all of Mark's Gospel, is that the scribe has recognized that Jesus hasn't given two commandments and so dodged his question. Jesus has given one commandment but said it two ways, that loving God completely and loving one's neighbor as oneself are one and the same thing. That, I suggest to you, is the real meaning of "and" in the quotation from the Second Vatican Council's Lumen Gentium. That, in fact, intimate union with God and the unity of all of humanity are the same thing. That one cannot be intimately united with God, which is as good a definition of real holiness as any I've ever seen. One cannot be intimately united with God without simultaneously working for the good of all of humanity. The two go hand in hand. Because, in fact, it is the dignity of humanity which is at the heart of the whole of the gospel. If that is so, then I suggest to you that what flows from the Incarnation as the center of our faith, and certainly the center of our spiritual tradition, is an insistence on reverence for all of humanity, including one's own humanity. It is only in recognizing the intrinsic dignity, value, and worth of oneself and of all other human beings that one can be said to genuinely love God, to come into true unity with God. That's been said recently by a very distinguished Roman Catholic theologian. Some years ago, that very distinguished theologian wrote that Christianity is an attitude of amazement at the dignity of the human person. Isn't that remarkable? A definition of Christianity which doesn't mention God. It doesn't say that it's the love of God or the worship of God or reverence for God or union with God, but rather the attitude of amazement at the dignity of the human person. Now, you may say to yourself, yes, but you can find theologians who'll say anything these days. That very distinguished Roman Catholic theologian, however, was John Paul II in his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis. And it is, I think, a recapturing of something very central to our faith. Indeed, if I had to sum it up in a single phrase, I don't think it could be done better than in the words of St. Irenaeus, a great father of the Church from the end of the 2nd century, who wrote that the glory of God is a human being fully alive. That claim of Irenaeus is deeply rooted in the Christian insight of the Incarnation. The insistence that the one who was in the form of God did not think being God anything to be clung to, but emptied himself and became like us in all things except sin. That if we are going to be like God, that we must be fully human, because God has chosen to become like us.